Hello, and welcome to week 3 of this little Bible study on the different Gospels and their version of the Eastern narrative. I hope you've been enjoying this little series. I've been enjoying recording them. They're short, they're sweet, they're different for me because I'm used to teaching a class and interacting with people, and so this idea of a lecture style is a little bit different for me. But I hope you are enjoying it and getting something out of it. Again, if you want to, please interact in the comments. For some reason, I'm figuring out why YouTube has disabled our comments. Maybe we'll get those up and running soon. But feel free to add your thoughts, your ideas, your comments. That is the whole point of this. It's not just me lecturing at you, but it's our interaction together, because I'll be checking and I get a notification if somebody leaves a comment on there. So I'll try to respond if it's a question, but I'll just read if it's a comment. So this week, we will be taking a look at the Gospel of Luke. Luke happens to be one of my favorite Gospels because Luke is really wide welcoming. That is the Gospel's main focus, written primarily for a Gentile audience, so Gentiles converted to Christianity. The idea was it would be read in what were called house churches. So, when we talk about churches and churches of Paul, usually what I meant is that people would gather in their house. They would have a small meal together, usually, with bread and wine to bring that communion element. They would read some kind of scripture and talk about who Jesus was. That was the early version of worship. There was a persecution going on, so oftentimes they had to run after what they did. But it's why we have the ichthys fish. And if you don't know what the ichthys fish is if you've ever seen on the back of a car or something, a fish that kind of looks like that, that was the early Christian symbol instead of the cross. The idea was the fish's nose, I guess you would call it, pointed the way of where the gathering was for Christians. Since there was a persecution going on, you obviously couldn't just walk into a local church, so you had to know which house things were gathering in. So you followed the ichthys fish, since they were fishermen of people, and you would follow the nose, and that's how you knew what house it was there. That symbol still stays today, but that's what that ichthys fish is, and it's called an ichthys fish because those are the Greek letters of Jesus's name. And so house churches were how we had church. People, again, gather in small houses and go from there. This gospel was written for those types of gathering. The idea was that you would read the whole scroll from beginning to end, if you could, or read as much of it as you can, and then you would leave reflecting on what you had just learned. This was written probably around 80 to 110 AD, we're guessing. The temple, this is how we kind of guess. The temple is destroyed at this point, which happened in 70 AD, but we don't know quite for sure between 80 and 110 because there were so many copies of the scroll, and a lot of them were different. And so, scrolls were handwritten. They weren't mass produced like we had. The printing press didn't get invented until the 1500s. So scrolls were precious, and you would write each thing out. And what would happen is they would be revised along the way. Language would change and ideas would change. And so when we found them, there were multiple copies of Luke. That's how important this gospel was. And it's the only gospel to have two parts. So the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same person, addressed in the beginning to the same person, which is Theophilus, or lover of God, which could be you, which could be me, which could be any Christian that was walking around at that time. The idea was Luke was writing to the people who love God and wanted to learn all about Jesus. And so he wrote two sections, right? The gospel, which talks about Jesus, and the book of Acts, which talks about the disciples and how the movement continued well after Jesus. If you hold them up together, you will see lots and lots of parallels that happen within the two books. It's fun to study both of them back to back because you do see so many parallels when you do that. Paul becomes the Christ-like figure in the book of Acts, where Jesus is the Christ figure in the book of Luke. And so when I say, again, Luke wrote it, I've said this previously, but it is more than likely the school of Luke. Luke himself was a physician, a convert of Paul, and what the disciples would do is they would go and they would create their own house churches and teach for a period of time, and people would write down what they taught. And so often when I say Luke or Matthew or Mark, I'm really talking about the school of them, meaning the followers, the disciples of them. So that's what I mean by that, and that's why there were so many copies. Is Luke was quite proficient in how many churches he got started, and so there were multiple copies of the Gospel of Luke as well as the Acts of the Apostles. And so again, Luke is very wide open to people coming into this movement. He is not a Jewish convert. I mean, yeah, he was a Gentile. He wanted as many people in the movement as possible. Matthew, again, was written kind of in response to Paul. He wanted the movement to stay pretty much a Jewish movement, where Paul and Luke and Mark wanted it wider open to include the Gentiles, aka non-Jewish people, into the movement as well. And so there was a little division between the two groups, but we have to be thankful that Paul's division won, because all of us are here, let's just say. And so Luke has some pretty unique parables in his gospel. The parable of the prodigal son, for example, doesn't appear in the other two Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, I should say, and it doesn't appear in John at all. John has no parables, which we'll talk about next week, but the prodigal is there. But towards the end, the uniqueness of Luke comes out in that the thieves on the cross talk to Jesus. Besides the one line, there's an actual interaction, and Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," talking to the thieves, talking to us, those that are behind, so to speak, the death of Jesus. All of us are included in that. Today you will be with me in paradise. The centurion also declares that Jesus is an innocent man at Jesus' death, which is unique to Luke. Again, Luke has some unique aspects of his gospel because he wanted more people, not fewer people. He wanted this to be wide open, that the love of Jesus expands to everybody, no matter who they are. And that's why I particularly like the Gospel of Luke. That is my mentality, that is my theology, and so it works right with what I would preach on a normal Sunday. So here we have the Easter narrative. Jesus has died, as again the centurion has declared this man was innocent. Joseph has come and laid the body in a tomb. In this case, it was Joseph of Arimathea, who is a member of the council. So we have a convert instantly on the council who comes and takes Jesus' body and lays him in the tomb. And so again, we have the women, but notice the little difference that will happen than you heard in Mark and Matthew. And so we begin with the 24th chapter of Luke, and let's take a breath before we read. The 24th chapter. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood behind them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe him. But Peter got up, ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. So again, we have the women going to the tomb in all the synoptic gospels. The women are the first ones who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. In this one, though, we have two people, both dressed in white. That is a similar pattern throughout everything, saying the same thing. He is not here, he is risen. But in this case, the stone has been rolled away already. There is no kind of earthquakes or anything like that. This is pretty normal, if you, I mean, for the dead rising. But you know, the idea is it's very casual. It's very there's nothing mystical about this in this moment, except we have the angelic voices, or the angelic representatives, the messengers of God, saying he is not here. The women are once again perplexed rather than terrified. So that is a slight difference there. So the women are trying to remember what's going on, and then the angelic hosts reminds them of what Jesus has said to them, and that to go ahead and tell the disciples. So the women, like in Matthew, go and tell the disciples. But here's where the difference is, right? I don't know if you picked it up. As the disciples are listening, they choose to ignore what the women are saying. That little line, they call it an idle tale. So the women are the first witnesses to the resurrection. The men don't believe them. And I'm saying this because in the Gospel of Luke especially, women play a very prominent role in the life of the church, in the life of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke, for example, opens with Elizabeth, not with Mary. And so women play a huge role. Mary and Elizabeth talk to one another throughout the gospel. Women are often named rather than just a woman. They would have a name associated with them. So for Luke, women are important in the movement of Christianity and are one of the main centerpieces of the movement of Christianity. So much so that the men choose to ignore the women in this time, and the women are right. So get over it, dudes. And that's the idea, is that women are prominent. You should listen to them. You should pay attention to what they're saying. And in a very male-driven world, which these gospels are being written in, this is a very radical message that Luke is sending out. That women are part of this movement. They aren't just there to cook, clean, provide hospitality. They are there to preach. They are there to teach. They are there to prophesy. In fact, we're going to have a lot of women leaders of house churches coming up in the book of Acts. And so Luke really wants to lay that focus on, in saying that the women are speaking, the disciples aren't paying attention, and then Peter decides to go see for himself and walks away just kind of perplexed and wondering what is going on. Again, Peter is the one that had denied Jesus, and so Peter's a prominent person in all of these. Luke will then continue with the road to Emmaus. So Jesus doesn't appear to the disciples first. He appears to two followers who are walking home from all the activity, and walks with them and listens to them and begins to teach before he appears to the disciples in their home. It's all happening on the same day, so it's a very long day, but this is the uniqueness of Luke. Because the two walking home from Emmaus are a disciple and a female companion. I think it says his wife. I just put the book away, and I should have looked that up right away. But again, men and women are included in this movement. So I hope you enjoyed this aspect and this version of the Easter narrative from Luke. It is very different. It is shorter, if you can notice, but it's also, again, unique because of the focus on women. This week ends what are called the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are three that are bound together, and they call them the Synoptics because they tend to match one another They follow what was a document called Q. I know that has a lot of loaded heaviness in this day and age, but Q was a source that was used. The way people kept track of Jesus is he would walk and teach, and people would just write down everything he said, not necessarily where he was or anything like that. That's why we get some differences there. But then they also draw from Mark and things like that. So they match one another pretty well. John is next week. He comes much later and writes his gospel a lot later. Things have changed in the Christian movement. And so John writes a very unique gospel. He's not included in what's called the Synoptic Gospels, those three. He is his own writings and his own personality and everything. As I gave you a little hint, Jesus does not teach in parables in the book of John. There are barely any. And so Jesus is a different portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of John, but we'll talk about that next week. I hope you enjoyed this. Take care, everybody.